From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And in today's lineup, K-State's Dan O'Brien. He'll look closer at the confidence level in the USDA's new crop production and grain stocks numbers that were released a week ago, and to what extent those numbers could change. That part of Dan's weekly commentary on the grain market trends. Then K-State's Mike Stamm will offer his evaluation of the new canola crop in Kansas, whether it was impaired by the sharp drop in temperatures earlier this week. Mike will also preview 2 K-State marketing workshops for you canola growers taking place next week. And checking in later on, K-State's Mary Knapp for her weekly visit on Kansas agricultural weather. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. This is Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. As always, great to have you along with us, and we'll take up the grain markets first of all right here, as we typically do on a Friday, and with the good help of Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, as he'll provide his weekly analysis on the trades. We need to step back a few days to the USDA's World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates a week ago this morning, Dan, and the market has had obviously several sessions to chew on those numbers and react. And by and large, it's been something of a muted response to the numbers, hasn't it?
Yeah, ups and downs. You know, we'd seen in the corn market coming out of Monday, we had traded a bit higher to some degree. We're about 368 or so for a close. It traded up to about 378 thereabouts. Now settled down a little bit more on yesterday's close. So kind of up and down, not falling off. And that's probably the fear of people in the feed grain market, that there'd be a surprise number out there and that we see a hard trend even lower than where we're at. I think if I were sizing up the corn futures market in particular, it's a market that isn't worried about generally the quantity of supply in large degree, but the late harvest problems that have persisted and questions about, especially the northern states that are so affected by delayed harvest, of ears per acre, the weight of ears, test weights, all of that are taking more of a center stage away from all the acreage issues that we'd had earlier. So right now the corn market still waiting, still have a fair amount of crop in the field. As of November 10th, nationally we had 66% of the crop harvested, and as opposed to 85 for the 5-year average, and still I guess for our colleagues to the north, North Dakota, 15% harvested as opposed to 76. South Dakota, 39% as opposed to 82. And all those northern states aren't doing just great. We have people that through K-State that we're associated with that farm in Iowa, not far from the Cedar Rapids area, and they are tremendously delayed in harvest for both corn and for soybeans. So corn will stand in the field, generally do pretty well if it doesn't drop. Soybeans standing out in the field, how will they respond to moisture and the possibility of pods not holding up as well in terms of keeping beans? So anyway, you've got those types of issues. Mm-hmm. But when you look at since I mentioned the soybean market, we had gotten up again early part of October to about 960. Closed yesterday about 916. Coming out of the reports last Friday, just sort of an up and down kind of a trading range thing, almost as if we're just sort of waiting for some more definitive news to come. And again, since the December report on December 10th won't have a crop survey component to it, these questions for corn, for soybeans, for grain sorghum, any fall harvested crop, probably now will be delayed off into that January 10th report, and that's probably the next time frame, at least with what we can anticipate, that could bring uncertainty and volatility to the market.
And worth consideration tied into that, Dan, and this is in your weekly notes on the grain trades, the margin for error in these reports has been captured in an analysis here and on both the production and the grain stocks sides, and that's worth talking about.
Yeah, so as you can tell from our discussion, if there are risks, they're to the downside, more so in terms of basically with in the northern states with so many crops still in the field. When you look at the production number for corn, again, the USDA came out on Friday, said that gave their projection of about 13.661 billion bushels for the size of the 2019 corn crop. And if you read in the back of the report, they say, well, gosh, there's about a 1.3% variation off that number. We'll put you in a 67% confidence interval, basically 2 out of 3, and about a 2.2% variation puts you in a 90% interval. So if we're wondering about the possibility of lower crops, and we look towards history to see just how accurate the USDA has been, and when they have missed, how bad has it been? Well, a 2/3 confidence interval on the low end would say that, gosh, that 13.66 could drop to about 13.48, so that's about 200 million bushels. A 90% confidence interval, and with the odd year we've had, that's surely not out of the realm of possibility. 13.6 drops to about 13.36. So that's saying that 200 to 300 million bushel drop would not be a surprise to the market. And that leads then to where the ending stocks would go. They also have projections of accuracy on that. So the USDA projected 1.9 billion for ending stocks for this 1920 marketing year that'll end August 31st. So that's fine. It is as it is. 2 out of 3 forecast accuracy for that is about 1.4, 1.5 billion bushel on the low side, 1.1, 1.2 at a 90% confidence interval. And for soybeans, the numbers, based on their own forecast accuracy, when you start talking about ending stocks, again, the soybean projection is about 475 million bushels. Historically, when they've been low, on the bottom side, about 240, 250 million bushels would be about where they're at. And the 90% confidence interval takes it below 100. So I remember some statements about what people can do with figures and the character of people that rely too much on them. So I don't want to fall into those. But the point is that by their own analysis, the USDA is saying there is still an awful lot of room for variation in their forecast.
Let's spend the balance of our time on the export scene then, for corn, for soybeans, and for wheat. Don't want to overlook some good vibes coming from that market, but there's been a little bump in corn exports, and at least that's something to the positive.
Yeah, I think that, market analysis in general has been supporting the idea that the lack of export business for corn, the slowness of movement has kept ongoing positive news from coming to the market, and generally have been a ready excuse for traders to not be that terribly worried about the supply side, because the daily, weekly demand side has been weaker, and with questions about ethanol in parts of the country too, particularly where we don't have as much corn this year in the Eastern Corn Belt. Anyway, you bring all that together, and the USDA export projections for corn were at about 22 million bushels for the week ending November the 7th. That's about double of what we'd seen for the week ending right at the end of October. And why would that be something to pay attention to? Well, part of the issue in the corn market is that we have ready supplies elsewhere, particularly Brazil, but they do have some limit in quantity in terms of how long they can keep providing leadership in the market. So as for you and I, Eric, I think we'll just keep watching that export number on a weekly basis. If it starts to move to the higher side, that's a signal that buyers in the market are running out of ready supplies down South America, and they could be coming this way, and that towards the U.S., that would be positive for demand and for prices. I would say while we're looking in the feed grain area, for grain sorghum, have been moving generally pretty slow for grain sorghum exports, but here on the basically the 10th week of the marketing year, we're at about 15.8 million bushels. Project the USDA out of that report, kind of a hidden surprise. They raised the U.S. grain sorghum export projection by about 10 million bushels up to 110. So anticipation of some movement there, and I guess for the grain sorghum industry in Kansas and elsewhere, that's a welcome sentiment. Mm-hmm. I would add for wheat also that for the first time in several weeks, we've had an estimate of the amount of export shipments that occurred that was actually above the amount needed to meet the USDA's estimate of total exports for the marketing year. So
that's a rarity, isn't it?
Anymore, gosh, that means something positive in the wheat market. What's going on? Anyway, but that is a positive there. And I would say, gosh, when you look at the charts of the different commodities that we follow in Kansas, that, with the feed grains, corn and sorghum following corn, they've generally been moving lower sharply. For soybeans, just about the same pattern. For wheat, we've actually seen the futures since about September 1 on a fairly steady upward trend. It's not a bend buster type of a thing where we're just shooting 45s higher, but we are trending steadily higher. And that's consistent with the generally positive basis levels we've seen in a number of areas of the state, too. So some export demand for wheat starting to come about, and maybe that's to the good. We'll see. We'll see, I guess.
And U.S. soybeans still moving in the world trade, but not robustly. We can't say that.
Yeah, we've got about a 6-month window of strong exports. So when we're going to, quote, make hay in soybeans, it comes after South American supplies are off the market and trying to beat or come in ahead of the next South American crop. So say there's a need for about 33 million bushels per week to meet the USDA's projection. We basically need to about double that. So pace we'd need is about 60-plus million bushels. We're coming in the last several weeks a little bit higher than we had been, 50, 48, thereabouts. So that's the positive side. But again, all these other issues of U.S. trade discussions with China and elsewhere are all wrapped up in all these factors that are inhibiting to some degree the export demand that we'd like to see in U.S. soybeans.
Always appreciate it, Dan. We'll talk again next Friday. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien is a grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, getting together with us from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. And we'll be back with more shortly on Agriculture Today.
Kansas farmers and ranchers are helping feed your family in the world. The largest contributor to the Kansas economy is beef cattle. How do you get that juicy steak on your plate? In order for you to enjoy your tasty meal, it requires the hard work of the producers, marketers, advertisers, processors, inspectors, transporters, packers, and consumers. So thank all these people and sit back, relax, and enjoy your tasty meal.
Moving ahead now on Agriculture Today, an update on the state of the canola crop in Kansas. It parallels wheat in many respects in as far as what's happening to that crop, weather-wise and otherwise. And we're going to talk of a pair of canola risk-assessed marketing workshops for you growers coming up next week at 2 places in Kansas. Filling us in on all of that is K-State canola breeder Mike Stamm, who happens to be, as we speak, taking part in the U.S. Canola Association annual meeting in Washington State. In fact, Mike will be heading out and touring canola fields in that region here very shortly. But, Mike, before we take a look at how canola is faring in Kansas, what's happening at this national meeting of interest?
Eric, this is one of 2 meetings that the U.S. Canola Association has annually, and typically in the fall meeting, we go to an area where we are seeing some canola acreage, whether it's small acreage or, broader acreage across the U.S. And we try to meet with growers in that area and just kind of show them support for the crop. And also, I guess, sit around the board table and talk about some hot-button topic issues with canola. And right now, I guess you could say some of those topics would definitely be trade, Farm Bill implementation, and then one of the things that's on a lot of people's minds with all the problems that have occurred with harvest, say in the northern plains, and even in our area, some of the disaster aid and what's going on with that. But it's really an interesting board to me because It's a group that's made up of our industry members, so the seed companies, chemical companies, input suppliers, the crushers, and even some of the canola oil buyers, as well as producers of canola and academia like me. And we basically sit around the table and talk about these issues that are important to canola. And it's neat to have all those different interests in one room.
As you've been part of this exchange on, as you put it, the hot-button topics concerning canola production, do you get the sense, Mike, that the canola sector is in growth mode right now, or is it holding steady? What's your take on that?
Right now, I would say it's mostly holding steady. We've seen some recent growth in canola in the U.S. to the point now where we're over 2 million acres. Total planted acres. So, the majority of the growth has still been in the northern plains, like Montana and North Dakota, even a little bit into Minnesota, mostly because of spring canola. So we're not maybe seeing the growth on the winter side that we'd like to see in Kansas and Oklahoma. But as a whole, we've seen canola acres grow to that 2 million mark and have been kind of holding steady now.
Bringing it back closer to home, you mentioned Kansas, Oklahoma, the Central Plains. It bears repeating. Canola has carved out its niche here in this region, and for that acreage on which it's planted, it's a viable part of a cropping system.
Yeah, we have dedicated growers to the crop still. We know that economic times definitely are a challenge right now, and that makes taking on an alternative crop like canola a hard decision in some years. But there are growers that are still dedicated to the crop because we see the advantages that it provides in our wheat cropping systems.
Well, let's talk for a moment about how the new crop is doing in Kansas, planted here a couple of months back for most growers, and facing the same types of weather challenges that the wheat might be out there. What's the story right now? We've dry pockets around Kansas. Is that afflicting canola adversely now?
We could certainly use the rain in some areas, I would say. As we've seen on the drought monitor, we're starting to see drought start to stretch kind of across the strait from the southwest now into the central corridor. So some moisture this winter would certainly be beneficial. I think my biggest concern probably is just the variety of sizes that we're seeing in the crop heading into the winter. So growers who were able to get it established because they had soil moisture and to plant it on time, and, their canola looks really good going into these winter months where we're going to start to see it go dormant. So, this major cold snap we had here over the last week, we're probably going to make it through it okay with that canola. It's not as big of a concern as some of the canola that's smaller yet that was planted late because some of the growers had to wait on rain to plant. And then, as you know, the end of September and into early October, we were so wet, and so it was really challenging to get back in the field and get those acres seeded. And so the smaller canola, I'm a little bit concerned about what these cold temperatures did. I guess it's just kind of a wait-and-see mode. I give it some time to see if it rebounds from that.
And that really is the point. As is the case with wheat, it may be until even spring green-up before the full extent of any cold damage is evident in those later planted canola stands.
Yeah, that's right. Producers can go out now and look at things, try to make a determination on how it's doing. But the best thing to do is to give it some time. It looks like temperatures are going to kind of rebound now, and we're going to warm back up. And, even if canola's been frozen down hard a time or two this time of year, if we get some warm weather, it can actually start to grow again. So it might be beneficial for temperatures to warm back up and get a little bit of rain and rejuvenate the crop a little bit. And we just don't need these broad temperature swings over and over again. That becomes a challenge.
Well, that leads us into the other item we wanted to tell folks about today. There are these 2 canola risk-assessed marketing workshops hosted by Kansas State University coming up next week, Tuesday and Wednesday, to be precise. We'll share the locations in just a minute. What is the aim of these workshops, Mike?
Well, the aim of the workshops is really risk management education. And when you think about risk management for canola, I kind of like to think of it in 3 categories. We've got production risk, which is kind of my area of expertise. In production risk, you can talk about selecting the right variety, different production practices, and so forth. So we're going to focus on production risk. We're also going to talk a bit about marketing risk and the local market currently, what market prices are, how those market prices are derived. And also we're going to talk about some financial risk and talk about crop inputs and talk about some areas maybe where we can modify what we're doing with inputs to help save some money at this point in time, or to be more efficient with our inputs. And so we're going to talk, kind of across the board of canola production from the very basics to what you do at the end. And so I think it's still important to have these opportunities for growers to continue to learn. Having the risk management tools to get through these challenging times, I think, is really important.
And specifically, K-State's Dan O'Brien will take up the economics of canola production. Monty Vanderveer of K-State will look at the risk management side of it, the insurance in particular there. And you will have on board somebody on the receiving end of the crop, if you will, a merchandiser, to talk about the market outlets available to producers.
That's right. We'll have ADM, who is our primary crusher for the crop. They'll be there to talk about options for delivering the crop to that facility.
Very good. And for your part, you will be, among other things, Mike, sharing the latest on the Roundup Ready canola varieties that have emerged from the K-State program, so you'll be able to tell the full story there.
Yeah, I'll be covering what we're doing with variety development and what we've seen recently in terms of our varieties' performance, as well as just some of your basic production risks that we've encountered over the years to head producers in the right path down the road of growing canola.
Very well. It's a great program coming up at 2 locations next week, Tuesday, November the 19th. That'll be in Copeland, southwest Kansas, at the American Legion Club there in Copeland. Then the following day, Wednesday, November the 20th, at Argonia in south central Kansas, Harper County, at the Argonia Friends Church. Beginning with registration at 8:30 at both sites. The welcome and the opening session will take place at 8:45. The program continues right up until noon at each of these. And you can contact the local extension outlets that are hosting these at Gray County, the Wild West Extension District, Harper County, or Sumner County, and they can fill you in full on registering for either of these. So take those in, canola producers. And once again, Mike, we're off and running on another canola production season in Kansas. It has its fits and starts, but by and large, it, as it looks now, could be a decent year for production in the state. Is that your take?
I hope so. We can get this weather to kind of straighten out and give us a normal winter, whatever that is now. That would be beneficial. But yeah, some rain and a little warmer temperature, I'd be happy.
Hey, enjoy the rest of the proceedings at the U.S. Canola Association session out there in Washington State, and we will see you again soon. Appreciate your time, Mike.
Thank you, Eric.
That's Mike Stamm, canola breeder at K-State's Department of Agronomy. And once more, these 2019 K-State Canola Risk Assessed Marketing Workshops taking place next week, Tuesday the 19th, Copeland, Wednesday the 20th at Argonia. No fee for taking part in either of these, but do, if you can, touch base with those host extension offices to let them know you'll be attending next week. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Now we'll break away for a few moments, and then when we come back, today's agricultural news headlines for you. This week's Kansas Wheat Scoop, also ahead, as is K-State's Mary Knapp on Kansas Agricultural Weather, right here on the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Now in in our 95th year of service to Kansas and Central Plains agriculture. This is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Next up, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. And for your daily dose of news about U.S.-China trade relations, the two countries continue to hold in-depth discussions on the Phase 1 of the trade deal, with the cancellation of tariffs still the key issue. That, according to the latest from Commerce Ministry spokesperson Zhao Feng. However, Zhao did not appear to have addressed the issue of increasing buys of U.S. commodities. That's a U.S. demand in the negotiations in the Phase 1 deal. And a component of the deal that the Wall Street Journal reported on Wednesday was the latest sticking point. China sources indicated the country was reluctant to put specific dollar amounts into the agreement, but it's clear that getting the tariffs removed is a key for the Chinese. Now, President Trump on Wednesday had indicated that the talks between the two sides were going rapidly, in his words, and he did not reprise his threat to raise tariffs on China in the event an agreement is not reached. Meantime, China has announced it will lift its ban on imports of poultry meat from the U.S., making official the plan that was announced by China's Commerce Ministry back in late October. Here's more on that from the USDA's Rod Bain.
A market for U.S. poultry products has been reestablished.
China announced that their country is now reopened to U.S. poultry.
Agriculture Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs Ted McKinney in Kansas City Thursday said China agreed to lift a 4-year ban implemented due to a highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak. The ban had remained, although the U.S. has been high-path AI free since August 2017.
We're still working with them on the regionalization protocol, which basically says if high-path avian flu is in one part of the country, the rest of the U.S. gets to ship.
The Undersecretary explained in terms of poultry exports to China.
This is ducks, this is turkey, this is broilers, this is egg and egg products.
And noted the timing of the lifted ban, as China's swine population is impacted by African swine fever.
They need protein, and here comes some protein.
From the National Association of Farm Broadcasting Convention in Kansas City, I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says now that Democrats are moving toward a deal with the Trump administration on the renegotiated trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, which could result in a victory for the president and be one of the few bipartisan legislative accomplishments of this Congress. Pelosi said she would like to see this done before the House adjourns for Christmas in a few weeks. House Democrat lawmakers have been going back and forth with U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer on provisions in the pact since the summer. The key focus there has been making USMCA more enforceable. That's a primary objection that Democrats have to the agreement, which was negotiated by Mr. Trump. Democrats are still waiting on commitments from Lighthizer in their requests to make the deal more enforceable, which is a top issue for labor unions, according to one Democrat congressional aide. And any hope for an extension of the biodiesel blenders tax credit may depend on whether it can be attached to a must-pass legislation at the end of this year or the beginning of next year. According to officials with the industry, the $1 blenders credit expired in December of 2017. Since then, there have been legislative attempts to finish a multi-year extension. Congress faces a November 21st deadline to keep the government open, and there is talk in Washington about passing temporary spending measures as soon as next week, of which the blenders tax credit might be attached. Well, Brazil's government has announced that it intends to relax its restrictions on wheat imports, opening up its market to U.S. wheat exports. This could prove highly advantageous for high-quality wheat-producing countries like the U.S. Marcia Boswell has more on that on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
A significant impediment to U.S. wheat sales to the large Brazilian market is likely to end soon. Brazil's government has announced it intends to implement a tariff rate quota, or TRQ, allowing up to 750,000 metric tons of wheat to be imported duty-free from countries outside the Mercosur trade agreement. Brazil first agreed to this TRQ some 24 years ago when it joined the World Trade Organization. The Brazilian government is now moving forward with developing a final process and date for implementing the TRQ. Through U.S. Wheat Associates and the U.S. government, wheat farmers have worked and negotiated for several years with Brazil's government to open the TRQ and create a more open market there for U.S. hard red winter and soft red winter wheat. According to U.S. Wheat Associates President Vince Peterson, Brazil is a quality-focused wheat market, and its flour millers recognize that U.S. wheat can help them better meet their customers' needs. Opening the TRQ will give those millers more consistent access to our wheat classes, while still having the option to source from other countries. That is how the market should work, and we welcome this opportunity. Doug Goings, U.S. Wheat Associates chairman and a wheat farmer from Paulding, Ohio, said this is a perfect example of how fulfilling commitments can work for all trading partners. We want to recognize Ambassador Greg Dowd, our chief agricultural negotiator at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and USDA Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs, Ted McKinney, as well as the career staff of USDA and USTR for their focus on this issue. They have raised it multiple times with their counterparts in Brazil. Brazil is the fourth largest wheat importer in the world, but Argentina and other countries in the Mercosur Agreement have had a competitive advantage with mostly unlimited duty-free access to the market. Wheat imports from countries outside the Mercosur Agreement, including the United States, are subject to a 10% tariff. However, U.S. Wheat Associates has always conducted activities in Brazil to keep its millers and bakers informed about the quality and value of U.S. wheat. As a result, when Brazil opened provisional TRQs in 2008, 13, and 14, because its Mercosur partners had wheat supply challenges, U.S. hard red winter and soft red winter wheat made up more than 80% of imports. U.S. Wheat Associates' mission is to develop, maintain, and expand international markets to enhance wheat's profitability for U.S. wheat producers and its value for their customers in more than 100 countries. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. Want to remind you here that each of our weekday broadcasts is available in podcast form for downloading and listening to directly or for automatic downloading to your mobile device. To initiate either of those options, visit agtoday.net. This is Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're listening to Agriculture Today, and to top off this Friday edition, Kansas agricultural weather, and our weekly chat with Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. One thing, Mary, that we can say definitively, we had a wintry start to the week in Kansas, most notably on the temperature side.
Right. It was extremely cold to go with the introduction of a little bit of snow. And we're still counting how many records were broken with that cold. But case in point, looking at our mesonet stations, of which we have 64 spread across the state, 50 of them set new record low temperatures. And it may surprise some people that the bulk of those were in the eastern part of the state. In fact, the 14 that didn't manage to break a record were dominating in the west. And the big difference in that is that in the west, it's not quite as unusual to have these cold intrusions, and so a little bit harder to break the records there. And that's despite the fact that some places got down below zero. It was a sub-zero cold snap, not just a below freezing type.
And we had a bit of a breeze associated with those low temperatures, too, which didn't help matters any.
Right. There were quite a few winds where the sustained winds were in the 30-mile-an-hour range, and, of course, gusts were beyond that. There was some moisture to go along with that, mostly in the eastern two-thirds of the state. To our north, in the north-central part and into Nebraska, they had snow. And in Kansas, we had a couple of reports of an inch or more, again, in that north-central part of the state.
Now, the soil temperatures this past week, did they decline in the wake of these ambient lows?
Yes, we did have some drops, and in some places we had the soil temperatures drop into the mid-20s. Again, those were in western Kansas where the soils are drier and they had the coldest temperatures. But they've rebounded fairly nicely, and looked at it yesterday, and all across the region, the soil temperatures at the 2-inch level were in the 40s. The weekly average is, again, in the 40 to 45 degree range, which is cold enough to help harden that winter wheat, but not so cold that it'll shut down all development.
So really not detrimental to fall-planted crops at this point?
At this point, no. It is fairly good for those fall-planted crops to give them a chance to get some root development going. The negative is that there's not a whole lot of moisture for those crops to work with, so we'll be watching for the next chance for precipitation.
And to that point, drought conditions officially fanning out further in the state?
They are still confined mostly to central Kansas and western Kansas, but we did have some expansion of the abnormally dry conditions, coupled with some expansion of the moderate and severe drought. We have not descended into extreme drought yet. At this time of the year, we don't typically see a lot of moisture. We do have, if you go back into the August time frame, quite a bit of moisture from the soils, and that river levels and pond levels are still fairly high, so it's a little bit harder to push that extreme drought.
But there are places that could certainly stand some form of moisture. And as we look ahead, it may be another week or so before tangible moisture rolls back in.
Right. If we look at the quantitative precip for this next week, ending next Friday, pretty much statewide is 0.
Again.
There is a slight chance for about 1/10 of an inch, again, hugging the eastern border. What we're really looking at is a system that's expected to come through next weekend into early Thanksgiving week. This is going to be more of a Pacific system rather than the Arctic blast that we had. A couple of advantages with those is, one, they tend not to be as cold, and the other is that there is a better chance that it'll drag some moisture along with it. It's, as I said, coming from the Pacific, not from the Gulf of Mexico, so how much of that moisture will make its way across the desert southwest and into Kansas is still debatable, but at least it's looking like there is that potential.
And would that likely overspread all of Kansas or be confined to the western part of the state?
At this point, the Climate Prediction Center's outlook is for above normal moisture across the state. The strongest signal is in the western part of the state. Keep in mind, the amounts vary quite a bit. The eastern part of the state tends to hold on to its daily moisture average a little bit better than the west, but here in Manhattan, we're down to about 0.03 of an inch a day on average at this time of the year, and it drops as we go later in the month. Out in western Kansas, you're looking at 1/100 or 2/100 of an inch a day for normal. So if you got 1/10 of an inch of rain out in western Kansas, that would be wetter than normal for the week. Wouldn't go as far as we would like it to erase some of the soil moisture deficits, but it would certainly help.
And seasonal temperatures ahead? No more Arctic plunges for a while anyway?
For at least the next 8 to 14 days, it's favoring warmer than normal temperatures rather than that strong signal for cold that we had to start February and actually continue until the last couple of days. But the weekend is expected to be seasonal, if not slightly warmer than normal, and looks like to end November we will be favoring a warmer than normal pattern.
And want to plug in briefly one added reminder about the wildfire danger that's out there. Again, there was a major fire in far northwest Kansas. There have been spot fires elsewhere in the state already. The conditions remain ripe for wildfire potential.
Right. We had plenty of active vegetation growth during the summer. That means there's a lot of fuel on the ground, a lot of the fine fuels. And they call it the 1 hour fuel rate because those fuels can dry down in as little as an hour. And accompanied with our warmer temperatures, we are looking at still having that wind chance there. And don't need to tell the producers that can mean things will go quickly.
Be cautious out there. And Mary, when we get together next week, we will have a closer look at that latest Thanksgiving holiday forecast. Until then, many thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
That's Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. And thanks to you as well for tuning in. Please be back with us here on Monday. Until then, Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.